Good morning. Today is January 24th, 2022. My name is Frank Farmer, and we're here today as part of the Veterans History Project. Today we have with us as our guest Congressman Michael Waltz. Let me say a few words about Congressman Waltz before I formally introduce him. He is a native Floridian, one of the few native Floridians around. He was
There's a few of us.
He was born in Boynton Beach and grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. He went to college at Virginia Military Institute. He is a distinguished military graduate of that institution, and after graduation he attended airborne school, went to Ranger School, and to Special Forces School, or Green Beret as we know it, and we'll talk to him about these schools in a minute. He has over 25 years of military duty, including the reserves, active duty, and the Florida National Guard. He has received numerous decorations, including 4 Bronze Stars, with 2 with a V device for valor. He is a colonel, is now retired. In addition to his military duties, he has also served in the Pentagon. He has served as a policy director for 2 Secretary of Defenses, Donald Rumsfeld and Robert Gates. He has also served as a counter-terrorist advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. So, Congressman Waltz, thank you very much for coming here today. We appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, thanks, Frank.
And first of all, let me thank you for your duty and your service to this country, both as a serviceman and as a congressman. I'm sure at times it seems like Congress may be more dangerous to serve in than the military, but today we're going to focus on.
There are days that I think that the tribes of Afghanistan are easier to figure out than politics in Washington.
And you, of course, served several tours of duty, and we're going to talk about today in Afghanistan, Africa, and the Middle East.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So let's start off with. You went to VMI, a military school. Had you always planned on having a military career? Why did you choose VMI? By the way, VMI may be a little less known than West Point for turning out military graduates, but it's turned out a number of very illustrious military graduates. I think George Marshall.
That's right.
Was a graduate of Virginia Military Institute. Of course, he was head of the Army during World War II, and later became Secretary of State and was the engineer of the Marshall Plan, which helped to reconstruct Europe after World War II.
That's right. He was also the only general officer to also receive a Nobel Peace Prize, which he received for the Marshall Plan. So funny you should bring him up. That's one of the things that inspired me to go. General Marshall was I've just always been enamored with military history, with these men and women who stand up in times of crisis for this country and do what it takes to defend this great nation. And General Marshall served his entire life. He was #1 in the top cadet out of VMI. Of course, led the country through World War II, had to manage personalities like MacArthur and Patton and Eisenhower and the Brits and our allies as well as a pretty darn strong commander-in-chief in FDR. But then wasn't done serving at the end of World War II and became Secretary of State and instituted what I think was the greatest rebuilding project in history ever, to rebuild Europe after World War II and set the stage. Think about everything that's happened since then in terms of global prosperity that has been led by American diplomacy, American leadership, and underscored by the United States military. All of that was George Marshall. So it was really his inspiration, and my priest at the time who really encouraged me to go to VMI and serve this great country.
Were there other members of your family who were in the military, your father or grandfather?
So yeah, I had my father. I never really knew him. My mother was an amazing single mom who climbed her way through the corporate ladder at Prudential up in Jacksonville and went from a clerk to retiring as an executive vice president. It took her 15 years to get through night school, and she ended up graduating the same year I did, right? We graduated at the same time, but she was a tough woman. My dad, though, was how we ended up in Jacksonville. He was a Navy chief. I had uncles that were all Navy. My grandfather were all Navy, and somehow I defected and went Army.
Well, tell us about your time at VMI. Do people that go to VMI, I assume that most of them, if not all of them, have in mind at least some military experience that they want to go through. When you go to VMI, do you go there as a cadet? Are you in uniform?
Yep, you go there as a cadet. You're in uniform. The school, the VMI, and the Citadel in South Carolina. Way back in the day, pre-Civil War, were the military academies for those state militias, and almost every state had one. Now there's really only a few left: VMI, the Citadel, Texas A&M, kind of. But it was inspired by West Point. It's a very similar experience. I would say a little bit tougher, but your head's shaved every Monday. You get the crap beat out of you by the upperclassmen, and eventually at the end you're recognized as a human being. But it's having to a very tough academic curriculum, physical mandatory sports or some type of physical activity. Now, the difference is you can do any of the branches. There's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines that you can that you can participate in and commission in, whereas the military academies obviously are dedicated to each branch. So that is a difference, but I actually thought it was great because we were working alongside, and I still have classmates that are doing very well, colonels, generals in the Marine Corps and the Air Force, and across the services.
Yeah. Now, do you when you go there, do you have an obligation to go into the military? Or?
Only if you go there on a full ROTC scholarship, and I was fortunate to do that. There are some who go there and do not commission. I don't know why you would go there, but there's a brotherhood that comes out of it, and there are some that go and don't commission, but most do.
Well, what's the percentage of people who enter VMI and then graduate? Do they graduate?
Oh, we lost. My class started with 430, and we ended up graduating around 200. So it was we lost about half over the course. And one of the things that it really prides itself on is having a very strict honor code. A cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate those who do, is something VMI takes incredibly seriously. And when one does violate that, there is a public ceremony called a drumming out that happens in the middle of the night, and the cadet is blackened from the rolls.
Did that happen often?
Oh, it did happen, and it leaves an impression. It didn't happen often, but when it happened, it definitely seared in your brain that your honor and your word is first and foremost, and I think rightly, as it should be.
And what was your major? Would they have majors at the VMI?
They do. It's primarily engineering. I figured out quickly that wasn't for me, and went international business and international relations. So I knew that I wanted to serve. I wanted to go in the military. I was there on an ROTC scholarship, and fortunately was able to sneak off, so to speak, and went and studied abroad in Spain. So I went from an all-male military school in the mountains of Virginia to the University of Valencia on the Med, and had a really good time. and came away fluent in Spanish, which has since become a little rusty.
Well, that's great. So you graduated, and then when you graduated, you continued your your military education. Yep. You went to airborne school. Airborne school, if I remember, is about a 3-week course at Fort Benning.
That's right.
Still the same?
I went as a cadet. Actually, went to airborne school. I went to Arctic warfare school. I actually commissioned then an armored cav officer, Army Special Forces is different from the SEALs in that you have to kind of mature and spend some time in big Army for a while, whether it's in infantry or armor, artillery. You can't apply to become an officer in the Green Berets until you're a captain. So I went and did armor for a while at Fort Stewart, ran around on tanks and blew things up, did a deployment over to the Middle East, but knew that I'd always wanted to go into the Green Berets.
Now, did you go into, you also completed Ranger School?
I did. I completed Ranger School right after my officer basic course. There were 36 of us in my officer basic course that tried out, and we were awarded 6 slots to Ranger School, and 2 of us made it through.
Now, how
so
long
it was pretty tight.
And now Ranger School is conducted at various geographical locations.
That's right.
Is it not the mountains of North Georgia up around Dahlonega, Georgia? Yep. And I think they send the Rangers up there for mountain training. Is that?
You start at Fort Benning, and you know, a lot of people weed out, and just in those initial being able to run, jump, shoot, and swim to the level the Rangers expect. And you get really hungry and really sleep deprived pretty fast. But then you go up to a mountain phase. At one point, there was a desert phase as well. You end up in the swamps in the panhandle of Florida at Eglin Air Force Base. Sadly, I went in the middle of winter. So nothing like being chest deep in 38-degree water, walking through a swamp. And in mountain phase, I'll never forget, our canteens froze solid. You know, how ironic, in the dead of winter we were having heat. You know, people were having heat injuries because they couldn't drink their water because it was frozen to their, frozen to their hip.
Now, how long was the total range?
Well, if you go straight through, it's about 2 months. I took what's called the extended course and had a recycle in there, and so it took me a little bit longer, unfortunately. But I lost 31 pounds in the course of it. You typically you average about 1 MRE a day and about half an hour to an hour sleep a night. And so it's the attrition. But you know, the attrition is significant. It's very significant. I think it hovers around 75 to 80%. Attrition. Yep.
Oh my gosh.
But at the end of the day, one of the things to understand about Ranger School is, yes, it focuses on light infantry tactics. You know, hey, you're in charge, get this squad over that mountain, across that stream, conduct an ambush, and do it to standard. The difficulty is everybody in that squad is hallucinating with lack of sleep, is literally, your muscles, your body is eating into muscle because there's no more fat, and you're in the same boat. So what it's really about is leadership. And when you're starving, exhausted, don't know which way is up or down, can you dig deep and lead men who are in that same position and get the job done? And I got to tell you, you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about human nature. It's people that you would never expect. You catch stealing food from their fellow soldiers. That's immediately you're out. And I thought back on those lessons a lot in combat.
Did you go through the Ranger School before you went to the Special Forces School?
I did.
Then you graduated from Ranger School, got finished with that.
Yep.
You completed your airborne training.
That's right.
And then you go to Special Forces training. And Special Forces training is conducted at Fort Bragg, is that correct?
That's right.
And tell us about that course.
Well, there's a 3-week selection. So this is just the basic tryout. And it's a lot of time on your own, and a lot of times with their evaluating how deep you can dig within yourself. So it'll be things like start running, a group of you. They don't tell you how far to go. They don't tell you how fast you have to go, but they tell you that the last 3 in the back of the pack won't make the cut. You can imagine psychologically, you start, nobody wants to be in the back, right? So you start pushing yourself farther and farther and farther, but you have no idea if you're going a mile or 8 miles. And so they really focus on the psychology of combat, and how to get through those types of gray area situations. Again, it was probably about an 80% attrition in the tryout. Then you have the actual course, which, depending on your specialty, in the Special Forces, everybody has a specialty. So you can be a medic, an engineer, a weapons specialist, or a communications specialist. Those different courses take, obviously our medics, they actually go and intern in trauma hospitals, dealing with gunshot wounds and everything they're going to have to deal with in combat. That takes a lot longer than the officer phase that I went through.
Yeah. So you've gone through your airborne training, you've gone through the Ranger training, you've gone through the Special Forces training, you're now wearing the Green Beret, and And of course, 9/11 occurs at that point, and people begin to realize that that Afghanistan has been a training and a shelter for terrorists, and President George W. Bush says we're going to go in and clean that up. When were you sent to Afghanistan?
Well, and just one piece on Green Berets that I think is important to understand. They're unique in any other military force in the world, and how they're different than, say, the SEALs or the Rangers. Those guys are the best at light infantry in the world. They will put a bullet in a bad guy's forehead, like they did on Osama bin Laden, anywhere around the world in the middle of the night in the toughest conditions. Green Berets are a bit different in that we have to learn multiple languages. We have to specialize in culture in a part of the world, in a certain part of the world. And we're employed very differently in that you can take 6 of us or 12 of us and put us in a valley or a village or a tribe, and we'll then train thousands of them to take care of our enemies for us. So I like to say that Rangers and SEALs are the greatest in the world at killing and taking care of our enemies. We like to train our friends to take care of our enemies for us and our local allies. And so, with that, I learned or tested out of Spanish, and we have an exercise at the end of our training called Robin Sage that encompasses the western half of North Carolina, where we actually infiltrate behind enemy lines. The local farmers and sheriffs and populace there have been participating in this since the 60s. It's really amazing, and we train a guerrilla force. But you know what the Army gives us? A bunch of cooks and supply clerks who the last thing they want to do is be out in the woods for a couple of weeks. So they're pissed off and they don't want to be there, much like you'd find in some guerrilla force, overseas. And we have to get them to by, with, and through, is like we say, to achieve our objectives. It's an amazing exercise. And I can't tell you how many times what I learned in Robin Sage, I found myself in the exact same situation in combat. So, 9/11 happened. I was called back in. I actually had to finish some additional training in that initial call-up that I hadn't finished, and took a quick trip over to Uzbekistan, and that's where we were running a lot of the support into Afghanistan, that first one. Interestingly, this was in the reserves in the National Guard. A lot of people don't appreciate the SEALs and the National Guard have reserve units. That meant when I got done, I had to find a day job. And through a mentor of mine, I was introduced to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics, that saw that even though we had had some initial success in Afghanistan, we had defeated the Taliban, Al-Qaeda was degraded, that it was going to become a narco state, that the opium trade there could ruin everything. And I found my day job when I got off that deployment. I helped stand up all of the counter-narcotics and counter-opium programs for Afghanistan, supporting the DEA and the State Department and others. And that's how I started my first job in the Pentagon.
Is that?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the narco trade in a few minutes in Afghanistan, but when the United States first went into Afghanistan, the reason given by the United States was that it was a haven and a training place for terrorists, and which had helped to lead to 9/11, and the United States was going to take care of that. What was the government at that time, the government of Afghanistan, how complicit were they in protecting these terrorists, people trained to hurt the how? Well,
the government of that time was the Taliban, and the Bush administration gave the Taliban a choice: hand over Osama bin Laden, denounce Al-Qaeda publicly, help us in bringing these terrorists to justice and not allowing them training camps and the ability to attack the United States and the West, and the Taliban refused. And so that's what then led to just a few teams of Green Berets backed by the United States Air Force kind of linking up with a number of the anti-Taliban factions called in the Northern Alliance, captured by the movie 12 Strong, and overthrowing the Taliban regime. Unfortunately, even though the regime was defeated and eventually we installed a democratic government backed by elections, the Taliban was really just chased over next door into Pakistan. And Al-Qaeda, and that's where Osama bin Laden went as well. And they began rebuilding, and
now,
caused us a lot of trouble over the next couple of years.
Pakistan is essentially an ally with the United States.
I call them a frenemy. Yeah.
Well, that probably leads to an answer to portion of my next question. How complicit was Pakistan in helping to protect Haven?
Having debated this and dealt with this both in the White House and in the Pentagon, and then seeing it out on the ground, we all knew that the parts of the Pakistani military and intelligence were supporting the Taliban, and to some extent supporting Al-Qaeda as well. The debate was it a matter of state policy? Were these some ungoverned areas and some rogue intelligence officers, or was it coming all the way from the top? And it wasn't until about 2008, 2009 we figured out, it was coming all the way from the top. The problem then was, what do you do about it? Because Pakistan also has a nuclear arsenal. They played both sides very well. Both sides of the game. They would pretend that they were doing something about it, and then we'd find out later on they really weren't. Because at the end of the day, Pakistan believed that the United States wasn't there for the long term, and that they could control the future of Afghanistan by controlling the Taliban. At the same time, they also had their archenemy, India, to their east, and the last thing they wanted was an Indian-friendly government in Afghanistan kind of in their backyard. So they used terrorism as a means, as a proxy to achieve their ends, at the same time taking billions of dollars from the United States to go after those same terrorists. They played us, they played us incredibly well.
Now, when we went into Afghanistan, of course, Afghanistan has an interesting history with other nations entering it, and has often been called the graveyard of empires.
That's right.
Because it seems like many countries have gone into Afghanistan, but have gotten kind of lost when they got into Afghanistan and didn't achieve anything.
That's right.
At first it was Tsarist Russia that tried to divide it up, and then Britain in the 1800s. And then, of course, Russia recently, 1970s, 80s, they left after 10 years. So when we went into Afghanistan, in your opinion, was there any real hope of coming out of Afghanistan with any kind of a unified government?
I think the difference in our situation, unlike any of those other countries, is that if we ignore it and we don't stabilize it some way, and I'm not talking massive nation building, but I think there are things we could have done with a very small presence to stabilize that government and their military. If we ignore it, it's going to follow us home. And none of those other countries faced international terrorism and the potential of international terrorists with weapons of mass destruction. And so Al-Qaeda and ISIS haven't gone away just because the United States is now left. And in fact, the intelligence is clear, like as of last week in a briefing I received, that they fully intend to hit the homeland again, and they're developing the capability to do so. So really, I think the question is, could we, with some support, with some logistics, and with a small presence there to make sure everything goes okay, could have helped the Afghan military to keep those terrorists at bay? It's almost like, you pay an insurance premium a little bit every month to prevent the big catastrophic event. And, would we have to be there for the long haul to prevent that catastrophic event back here? I think that's the question. I just don't think we have a choice. It's either deal with it now or deal with it later. What's the best way to deal with it?
Now, when you were over there, what was your capacity? I assume that you were there as an advisor or to the Afghan, for one
military,
of better, Democrat military, for one of a better term. Is that? What was your opinion of the Afghan forces.
And actually, you know, in my tour, we were kind of advisors to advisors. There were three of us, myself, a Special Forces medic, and a communications sergeant, embedded with an Arab task force, because remember we had a coalition over there, the NATO coalition, and we actually had some from Arab countries as well, from the UAE and Jordan, and partnered. So it was three of us, about 90 of them, and about 120 Afghan soldiers. So if I never eat goat again, I'll be okay. It was as close as I'll ever get to Lawrence of Arabia. We were out there in the mountains. There were some days I think our headquarters had forgotten about us, but that was okay. It was a pretty amazing experience.
Well, you've kind of answered my next question. Tell us about the climate and the living conditions. You already said the living conditions were pretty harsh, and you all were pretty much out on your own.
Yep.
It sounds like you ate with the Afghan forces, whatever food they had, which, as you said, goat was apparently pretty
goat
plentiful.
and chicken, and the chickens were scrawny, but they were enough. So we had a healthy dose of Cipro and antibiotics and stuff for what I called the intestinal jihad. That would wipe us out every couple of weeks. But we fought our way through it.
Now, what was the climate like? I assume that Afghanistan has various tropical or various geographical regions and different climate.
Yeah.
You said you were in the mountains. I assume that's
it was a full range. I mean, up in the north and the northeast, it's the foothills of the Himalayas. That stretch all the way over to Mount Everest in Tibet. Incredibly mountainous, steep, difficult terrain, and then it kind of migrates into a desert plain in the south and the southwest, with hills and mountains, but nothing like the ones up in the north. And the country's really bifurcated tribally. The Pashtun tribe is where the Taliban tends to generate most of its support. That's in the south and the east. And different ethnic groups, the Tajiks, related to the Tajiks in Tajikistan, the Uzbeks, Uzbekistan, Turkmen, which have more of a Turkish origin, are all in the north. And that typically has formed those groups the resistance to the Taliban and the Pashtun.
Well, I think part of the problems in Afghanistan is they have so many different ethnic groups. I think the last count there were at least 13 different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, which I assume have different loyalties to each other, and certainly different loyalties to what we would call a central government.
That's right. And about 2/3 of the Pashtun, which forms the tribal basis for the Taliban, are actually in Pakistan. So again, that's how, between the state support from Pakistani intelligence and having that tribal base in Pakistan, and if you think about it, going back to Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, or really any insurgency in the world, no counterinsurgency has ever been successful when they have outside support and when they have a sanctuary to rest and refit and to continue the insurgency. And it was a huge problem that we never solved.
Now, tell us, what is the Hindu Kush, and what is its significance in Afghanistan?
Well, the Hindu Kush is the mountain basis that really Afghanistan centers around, both culturally and geographically. But to your point on the fractured nature of it, the British did that on purpose. Or yet another, across the Middle East and Africa, those British map drawers back in the 19th century have caused us all kinds of problems. But they literally drew the borders to divide up these tribes and to form a buffer between then British India and Russia. And it's just an incredibly difficult country to govern. But Osama bin Laden knew that. And he knew of all the places to dig his roots in and to establish a base. It was going to be there in the graveyard of empires. But again, as long as the remnants of Al-Qaeda are threatening the United States, as long as now the offshoot ISIS is threatening the United States, I don't think we can just ignore the problem. I don't want to wait until it follows us back home to then have to send soldiers back over to deal with it.
Okay. Now, again, as you helped to train the Afghan security forces, what was your opinion of their ability?
Well, this is the society and the military is largely illiterate. So, for example, when you go out to, say, do mortar training or any of that type of stuff, you're starting with how to count. That's the level of what we're dealing with. Corruption was endemic there, but at the same time, everybody in that society grows up knowing how to use a gun and fighting. Right, so the soldiers were actually good fighters. It was the leadership that was, that was really tough to deal with sometimes.
I think your opinion is saying that you didn't have a whole lot of confidence in the leadership of the Afghan security forces.
It took time. They're getting better. I think this will be a generational effort over time. By a point of comparison, the South Korean army in the 1950s and 60s had as high of an illiteracy rate after occupation from Japan and how devastated that country was as Afghanistan has. But yet after 70 years of working with them and partnering with them, they are the professional force they are today. So I think it's somewhat unrealistic to think that the military, which was part of the Afghan society, was going to turn around in that quick of a time. Yet, back in Washington, I would then come off of my tours and come back to the Pentagon and the White House and see general after general saying, Mr. President, I can turn this Afghan army around on my watch. And I knew they were full of it. Yeah. I'm sitting there, respectfully, they would leave the room. I'll say, hey, boss, it's going to be a long time, and we've got to decide as a country, are we going to make this long-term investment?
Now, in Afghanistan, of course, there's always been those groups, the terrorist groups, and as you've pointed out, they still existed while you're the Taliban, Al-Qaeda.
They still exist right now.
They exist now. Who's arming them? Who is giving them money? Who is supporting them?
So these terrorist groups run themselves. Think of it as like the mafia. I mean, they're in everything. They're in counterfeiting. They're in counterfeiting cigarettes, counterfeiting money, stolen car rings. They've also fundraised a lot in the Gulf from some Islamic extremist charitable, they call themselves charitable organizations and donors there. The biggest thing they do is support the international opium and heroin trade. Afghanistan provides about 90% of the world's opium that eventually becomes heroin all throughout Europe, and they make millions and millions off of that. So it's quite ironic that on the one hand they preach this kind of pure version of Islam, but on the other hand, how they fund themselves is all kinds of illicit trafficking and drug trafficking and crime.
Now, some experts have said that one of the main sources of revenue, of course, for those terrorist groups is the production of opium. Is that
that's right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And what part does Pakistan play in that? Turning a blind eye?
Yeah, turning a blind eye. There's all different opinions and varying opinions on the level of support, but there definitely is support that they provide. I've always had a suspicion. We were continually finding brand new Chinese-made weapons all over the battlefield. Now, whether those were bought off the black market or actually surreptitiously provided. Same with Iran. Iran had a level of support to the Taliban as well. So basically, countries that want to see the United States, that want to do us harm, we're supporting, one way or another, we're supporting this insurgency. But a big financial driver was the drug trade, and that's one of my first policy positions in Washington, was to help combat that.
Okay. Now, did you lose any American troops or have any hurt or wounded?
We did. I mean, we had a decent number wounded. In my last tour, we had 6 killed from my unit, 2 that were directly under my command. I wear, this bracelet that I'm wearing is for one, Matt Pacino, Staff Sergeant, who was just a big hulk of a guy, brilliant guy, and volunteered to go out on point every single mission. The Taliban at that time were relying heavily on IEDs. Our jammers were pretty effective at stopping. They had remote trigger mechanisms, and so we had jammers on our vehicles that would interrupt the signal. So they had kind of gone back to old school to tripwires. And so when your vehicle hit the tripwire, the explosive was positioned to go right up through the bottom. And Matt volunteered to go out on a motorcycle or on an ATV, a four-wheeler, out ahead of our armored convoys so that he could see the ground. And I'll never forget stopping him before one mission, said, "Matt, you are pressing your luck, brother. I mean, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Sir, if I miss a tripwire or we miss one, I want it to just get me, not my 4 or 5 Green Berets and the vehicle behind me." I mean, think about that mentality. And then he went out and he missed one night.
Oh, yeah.
And I just very quickly, because he's near and dear to my heart, another Green Beret that I lost had premonitions of his death. They were so strong, and this was his 4th or 5th tour, they were so strong that he wrote lengthy letters to his wife, to his daughters, to all of his teammates. He even divvied up his gear that he knew, because we all love gear, and he knew who wanted what. They were that strong. Yet when he was killed, he wasn't hanging back on the base or saying, "You guys go." He was literally leading his Afghan partners charging a Taliban machine gun nest, and was shot in the head. He was the only medic on the team, and he had cross-trained everyone so well they were able to keep him alive even with a head wound till they evacuated him to Germany. We were able to fly his wife over so she could spend a last evening with him. And sorry, I get a little choked up, but
well, certainly.
Yeah. Now, those guys and those families are one of the reasons why I ran for office.
Sure. Now, in 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed by a SEAL team.
Yep.
An area pretty close to the National Military Academy in Pakistan.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer to the next question I'm going to ask. What part do you think Pakistan was complicit in helping to hide or conceal Osama?
I think they knew he was in Pakistan. This is of a lot of debate, right? But I think they knew he was in Pakistan. Whether they knew he was exactly at that compound, I don't know. But they weren't looking hard for him, put it to you that way. Terrorism and supporting these extremist groups have worked well for Pakistan as a force multiplier. It's tied down hundreds of thousands of Indian troops in the Indian Kashmir, and it's kept it's kept Afghanistan kind of under their thumb. The problem is eventually this snake is going to turn around and bite the hand that's trying to control it, and that's the Pakistani government. And why does that matter? Why does that matter to Americans? Well, if you think about it this way, population Iraq, 25 million. Population Afghanistan, 30 million. Population Pakistan, 210 million with nukes. And if that falls to a terrorist regime, then we're in big, big trouble.
Now, in 2014, NATO ended their mission in Afghanistan, pulled out, and the United States left a small contingency of troops. How do you think that was going up until this past year when we pulled out of Afghanistan?
Look, it wasn't going to, that small amount of troops wasn't going to result in a major victory. The Taliban defeated, terrorism gone. But what it did do was provide the support. Those guys weren't out really in the front lines fighting day in and day out. A few of the special forces were, but the vast majority weren't. But what they did do is provide the air support, the logistics support, the maintenance support, the intelligence support, really that kind of, and helped stiffen the Afghan military that was out doing the fighting. And again, as we saw, when we just yanked that away in 2021, the Afghan military wasn't ready without that collapse. Now, we can debate whether they should have been. Absolutely, and I wrote a whole book about the things we've done wrong, but they weren't. We've seen a massive collapse now, and I think you're going to see as a result a Taliban caliphate, a terrorist superstate, and they're coming for us.
Now, in 2020, it has been the announced intention of the United States for during the President Trump's administration to withdraw from Afghanistan, but there were certain conditions as part of the withdrawal. Are you aware, or can you tell us about some of those conditions for the withdrawal?
Yeah, sure. And I expressed my concern publicly, about that agreement and whether the Taliban were serious about living up to those conditions. But it was a public denunciation of Al Qaeda, actually working with our counterterrorism forces, the Taliban, to go after Al Qaeda, neither of which they ever did. Entering into serious negotiations with the Afghan government. And to abide by the Afghan constitution, which they never did, and to enter into a ceasefire in terms of laying down their arms. They never did. And then the fifth one was that they wouldn't attack U.S. forces, which they did abide by. So they stopped attacking us, but they ramped up their attacks against the Afghan military. They never entered into serious negotiations, and they never walked away from Al Qaeda. And for those reasons, I don't think they lived up to their agreement, and I wouldn't have abided by it.
Now, the majority of Americans, or the polls seem to show, that were in favor of getting out of Afghanistan, but seem to be shocked by the way we got out of Afghanistan. Is that a fair statement?
I think the problem with the polls is, if the question is, should we bring the troops home? 20 years been too long. Well, of course. I mean, that's why you saw 70-80% say, yeah, of course I want to bring the troops home. Heck, I want to bring the troops home. I don't want to see another soldier fall over there. But when you ask the question, do you agree with bringing the troops home if terrorism will rise again and threaten the homeland? Well, then you get a very different answer, right? And that's what President Biden never explained and never really, I think, worked through, is fine, if you're going to bring them out, how are we going to keep Al Qaeda and ISIS at bay with the Taliban that we know agrees with their worldview of radical Islam?
Now, it's usually an axiom of military strategy that if you're going to leave or retreat or whatever the term is, you take your equipment with you, or you destroy it so the enemy cannot use it.
Sure.
When we left Afghanistan, we left $80 billion worth of equipment, including over 23,000 Humvees, I think 33 Black Hawk helicopters, 606,000 assault rifles, artillery units. How did that happen? How did all that, which now the Taliban and Al Qaeda are divided, how did that happen?
Well, in fairness, that equipment was left for the Afghan military to continue fighting. But we also knew, and some reports are coming to light, that, and including the Inspector General for Afghanistan said, look, if you pull the maintenance support out, which was American provided, the Afghan Air Force is going to fail. If you pull the logistics and intelligence, the Afghan military is going to fail. So we didn't just leave that behind for the Taliban. It was left for the Afghan military, but the military made it clear to the White House, our military, that the Afghan army couldn't hold without that kind of support. And to your point, when we saw the cities and we saw the units starting to fall, why didn't we reverse course and destroy that equipment, much of which we could have, to prevent it from falling in the Taliban hands? But now you have the strongest and most heavily armed terrorist army the world has ever seen. And you're right, we are going to feel the ramifications of that in the region, but also, I think, back here at home.
Now, in the turmoil of the withdrawal, we also lost 13 American men and women. And again, how could that have happened?
Well, they shouldn't have ever been asked to defend an airport sitting in the middle of a city of 4 million people in Kabul, controlled by terrorists. We were essentially relying on terrorists to screen for other terrorists. And the real sad irony is the suicide bomber that killed those 13 Marines and soldiers was let out of prison in Bagram just a few weeks prior. Not only should they not have been there, we shouldn't have given up Bagram until we had everybody out. That's a major air base, 12,000-foot runway, easier to defend. And I, for one, as long as I'm in Congress, will get to the bottom of that decision. We can't get answers right now from this administration, but there will be investigative oversight, and I'll get to the bottom of it, and we'll hold people accountable. And by the way, it's not just a terrorism issue. That air base is the closest base in the world that we have to the Chinese border. It's the only base that we have in a country that borders China. It's just a few hundred miles away from their nuclear arsenal that they are rapidly expanding. So it's the only base that we have sandwiched between China, Russia, and Iran. So there was a great power aspect, competition aspect to this as well, and giving it away for nothing to me was just a phenomenal strategic mistake.
Now, as we left Afghanistan, we left some Americans behind and left a lot of, I think, Afghan allies or interpreters, people to help. So, you have any idea how many Americans and
well, there were hundreds and hundreds. We don't know for sure, and we've never gotten a straight answer from the State Department on it. But I can tell you, I was just in touch with a veterans group 2 days ago that is a retired SEAL that is on a plane to go get more Americans, green card holders, legal permanent residents, and their families out. And God bless them for stepping up to do what their government failed to do. But in my mind, it is absolutely un-American to leave our fellow citizens behind. It's un-American to abandon our allies. And it's un-American to leave our homeland now less safe because of this action. But again, thank God for these grassroots veterans organizations like Task Force Pineapple and Dynamo and Save Our Allies and others that privately funded planes, privately funded efforts. Some of these veterans have quit their jobs, exhausted their personal savings. They're not going to quit, and I'm not going to quit until we get everybody out, until we take care of our allies, until the country's safe.
Now, the United States, we lost over 2,000 men and women in Afghanistan, and looking back on it, what do you say, or what can you say to those mothers, fathers, husbands, and others who lost loved ones?
Well, to the veterans and to the Gold Star families, their service and their sacrifice was not in vain. Absolutely not. And they should hold their head high. We've had an entire generation, including my daughter who just turned 18, grow up now not worried about planes flying into buildings, not worried about suicide bombers going off on school buses or in shopping malls, and growing up with a level of safety and not worried about those terrorist threats. Why? Because we had brave men and women that were fighting the fight over there in places like Kabul and Kandahar, not back here, in places like San Bernardino or Pulse nightclub. And so they should be proud of that service. Unfortunately, as I've stated, the terrorists didn't get the memo that the war was over. And I do think we're going to have to deal with it one way or another, just like when we withdrew from Iraq completely and left nothing behind in 2011. 3 years later, we had an ISIS caliphate, and now we have soldiers back over there dealing with that. I think we're going to have to go deal with it again, and I hope we do it a lot more smartly this next time. But all of that is why I think we need more veterans in Congress that have a little dirt and sweat, tears under their fingernails to help make those strategic policy decisions.
Well, Congressman Waltz, we're running out of time, and
all right.
I do want to mention, though, you mentioned you've written a book about your experience. Sure. I think the book is a warrior diplomat, a Green Berets battle from Washington to Afghanistan. Is that correct?
That's right.
And,
that's right.
And
the proceeds of it go to veterans charities. But thank you. It takes a look from my perspectives in the White House and the Pentagon and out on the ground. How is it I'm sitting in the room and I see the President of the United States say, I want us to go this direction, and I'm out on the ground and we're going the opposite direction, right? It's been a hell of a run, but I will keep serving this great nation and fighting for that red, white, and blue any capacity I can till the day the good Lord takes me.
Right. Well, again, I want to thank you for taking the time to come here today and tell your story, and again, thank you for your service to this country, both militarily and in Congress, and good luck to you in the future, sir.
Thank you.
This is a project authorized by Congress and administered by the Library of Congress. The objective is to interview and video as many as possible those stories of veterans from World War II to the present. The Library of Congress archives these videos and makes them available to the public both in person and online. The library also encourages local venues such as historical societies and museums, like the one we're in at the present time, the New Smyrna Museum of History, to keep these and make these available to the local population.